All right, welcome to another round of Spotlights in Sustainable Year. Today we have Lara with us, who has been managing her woodland since 2018. She is a fractional executive and consultant, a startup founder, trained in sustainability at Cambridge, like myself. She loves balancing her desk work and also being part hands-on working with volunteers at the woodland walk wood. So today we're going to sort of cover three key things. So one is about the benefits of both tree planting and natural regeneration, as well to the hedges, exclosures, essentially of soil protection, and the idea of assess which approach to use and what to consider when planting. Yeah, we met through Philippine Mignot, a social enterprise consultant, which I hope I'm going to soon have also as a spotlight discussion. You can follow Lara and her adventures in LinkedIn /Lara M, and you want to find more about the woodland per se, you can check www.walkwoodhp5.co.uk and also on Instagram, walkwoodhp5. All right, so that's a tiny intro really, Lara. Tell us a bit more about yourself. What's the story behind your journey into the woodland world?
Hi, well, thank you very much for that intro. So let's jump to it on the wood. We are here in the Chilterns area of Natural Beauty. We are about 1 hour from London near Amersham. So this is actually, interestingly, one of the greenest areas in the UK, together with the High Weald, for a number of reasons. And you'll see that it's a gentle moraine area. So these are all glacial moraines. At the top, you'll have a soil which is more flinty. At the bottom, it's more chalky. These are ancient woods, but they've been clear fell after the war. The reason they are considered ancient, if they've always been wooded since the 1600s. So even if they've been clear fell, the soil has not been used for other things than wood, which is why you have this beautiful natural regeneration. You have larch, which was planted, and you have broadleaves, which grew in between. And the work that I've been doing on this woodland is really a work of enhancing the age diversity of the wood, enhancing its resilience towards climate change, and also securing some of the fundamentals in terms of community access. So we're very engaged with the community, working with volunteers, working with other woodland owners in the area on woodland corridors and other things. So I think it's very important to look at both the environmental sustainability and the land, but also the social sustainability, how it's been used, how it's accessible, how it's protected from fly tipping, and so on.
Thank you. And I'm still intrigued. How does someone with your truck suddenly goes and gets a woodland?
Well, I've always been into sustainability. It's just at one point I decided, what if instead of donating time and money to other causes, I would have my own project and learn from it. And of course, whatever you learn, then you give back to others as well. I started learning about woodlands during the pandemic, and you can do it online. There are a number of forums for small woodland owners. Started to draft more or less the budget, the criteria. I wanted it not too far from London because I want to be able to spend time here, even if the land is a little bit more expensive. And then just after the pandemic, I started looking for a wood, and I really fell in love with this area. We have a river down in the valley, which is really important for wildlife. It is, as I was mentioning, connected to other woods so that wildlife can go around. But it's also fairly self-contained 9 acres, which means you really can have a management plan. And actually, Forestry Commission is coming here to review the management plan with me in half hour. Yeah, it feels like an exam, I know. So this is how I started. And really, you get a lot of help from other people. So I did a little bit of desk study, books. I went to a couple of courses on woodland management in person. I regularly do webinars online. And there's also this community of other owners. And you really can help each other. Sometimes I take a picture of something I see. I ask what it is. Now I started answering to others as well. It's really good to have this exchange of ideas. And I think if you have a garden or a small space, you can find a lot of help that way. And no land is too small. Even if you have just 1 acre, half an acre, any biodiversity you can have there is very important. In fact, one of the things that I've been working on following Natural England is how you can do multiple usage of land. And any space is important. Look, I've been here only a few minutes. Look how many insects I have on my sleeve. This is so rare. As you know, we lost 80% of our insects in the country over the last few years. So even seeing this sort of small space, but where you can have that ground of the food chain being built, when we plant, you make a small hole, you see invertebrates that then feeds birds, that then supplies the whole chain of biodiversity and of life, really.
Yeah, it's amazing if we really start to look at what's around us when we're in nature, how much we can discover, right? Even when you're talking now, I'm seeing like robins land, a couple of foot away from me, digging around in the soil. It can be quite fun as well, can't it? You sort of come back to your childlike sort of way of discovering. So thinking about this and you talking about the soil and the importance of the soil, can you sort of give us a bit more insight into why though? Like, why do trees actually matter? What are their purpose?
I mean, first of all, nature is for itself, but of course, tree matters. There's a whole conversation about carbon, but it's also biodiversity and diversity of habitats. If you look at this wood, and it's not at its most scenic now because, of course, it's still relatively early spring, but you have about 15 different species of trees. You have green leaves. Above, you can see a kite overflying. Those are actually a very good example of reintroduction that's been very successful. This wood is also host to other predators. So we've had last year a nesting pair of buzzards. Sparrowhawk is a little bit more rare. And then we have owl at night. So, it's creating habitats for wildlife, and it starts small and it then really builds up the chain. It's also very important to have mature woodland because of the richness it entails. So if you look at the drought we had last summer, unfortunately, a lot of the land around here, even the fields were fairly parched, and people living in cities will be very familiar with that. This wood actually did very well. Some of the ground vegetation got affected, other took over. So some of this dog's mercury, which likes humidity, dried off, but then ground ivy took over. But the tree covered allowed for that, and you really feel a difference in the cleanliness of the air, in the temperature, in the kind of shelter that it gives to wildlife and to humans as well. Every time people spend time at the forest, even when they come volunteering, they really say at the end of the day how much better they feel and how important it is for mental health to connect to nature. At the same time, we do need to have that rotation and that diversity, which is why not only we had to clear some of the ash that's affected by dieback, but also create some space for light so that you can have that regrowth. And you asked me about the soil. The soil bank is very important. First of all, the topsoil is where most of the richness, most of the nutrients are. And we're losing a lot of soil with tilling. So whether it's just by not tilling and not grazing your garden, or by protecting spaces like this, which have been always wooded, have not been cultivated, is important. Second, you have a seed bank, and seeds can live up to even 20 years, depending on the species in the soil. So you see that as soon as there are the right conditions in terms of water, light, some plants will need colder winters, other won't, and so on. Plants do sprout out. A lot of plants have multi-year cycles, so you don't see them. This year, you won't see a lot of foxglove. We had a lot last year. Other plants have even longer cycle, which originally was to protect them from predators. If seeds seeded every year, predators would eat them. But if you don't find that many, and all of a sudden every, say, fifth or sixth year, you have a lot, predators don't keep up. Plants have their logic, but whenever you look at the forest, you really look at what's in the seed bank, and you really look at the ability to say, if a tree falls, what's going to regrow in that space. And also, I haven't mentioned fungi. This woodland has a lot of fungi pretty much year long. I always get surprised at the type of shape you find. And the mycelia in the soil help to pass information, how to transform nutrients and coexist with the trees. So that without going too poetic or too technical, but really plants do communicate through the soil because of the network of fungi that are in the soil. And what you see is only literally the top of the iceberg. But even now, when you don't see fungi under the soil, in the next 2-3 meters of soil, you have dormant seeds, you have fungi, you have invertebrates, you have so much life going on.
I mean, there is so much to pick from that, Lara, but I guess, from thinking in small scale and bringing all these big ideas to how we can apply them everywhere. You are right now sitting on, as you say, ancient woodland with mature trees. How about, you get a space, most of them will be a garden with lawn that has been mown all about, or even, with apply sort of those roles of lawn. How would you move into something a bit more permanent? including biodiversity, including trees? And how would you manage that so that it's a good habitat and also is productive?
Well, the first thing is the importance of hedges of low growth. So part of the work we've done here, and you see what we've been planting, is actually low growth trees to again create more habitats, more shelter for birds, ground nesting birds, and so on. I have a few patches of ivy, as you can see there, but there's not a lot of undergrowth. We're encouraging that. And this is something typically you can find in a garden. If you let the grass grow a little bit, you'll have more flowers. Of course, it supports more of the natural pollinators. We have like bumblebees. But if you can have a hedge, or you can encourage plants, and even not always clean your plants at the base. So for example, people tend to clean up a lot at the bottom and then let the plant grow. Leave a little bit of that bottom growth, because that's very good for hedgehog, that's very good for birds, that's very good for protection, and even for small predators like foxes, etc. on the other side, who then are looking at what's happening. So what we've done here is we've planted a lot of low-growing trees. We've also planted hazel at the edge. So think, what will grow in your garden will depend on exposure. This is a north-facing slope, so we've had to keep that into account. We have a frost pocket down there, and we have more acidic soil at the bottom and less at the top. That all influences the kind of things you can plant in your garden if you're looking at planting trees. So you have to consider the light, you have to consider the humidity, you have to consider the exposure. Try to plant things that are self-sustainable. It's very hard to plant things that will depend on humans. So what I try to do here is we try to look at what's native to this area and buy plants that are from the UK. But there's also another current of thoughts that says, well, let's look at how climate is changing. And so we have done some simulations with Forestry Commission. It's very hard to think in the range of 300-500 years, which is the life of a tree. But you can think of the next 50, 80 years and then think what species will thrive. And so what has been done is also to import species that come, say, from southern France or from slightly warmer climates, or maybe the south of England if you're in the north of England, and see how they thrive. And also encourage a little bit of exchange. So again, here you see that I have some conifers, some broadleaves, which will give a continuous green cover in the winter, but will also allow to have that diversity. So you kind of look at what you have in the soil, you mix and match, but it's very important to start with the ground vegetation. If you have a bigger garden that hasn't been mown a lot and you think that you might have a seed bank, then what you can do is also simply encourage regeneration. A lot of companies now are counting trees like, we're planting 500 a year on 9 acre. We're not planting a lot, but we built some exclosures, which are simply protecting areas from browsing. Essentially, you do the same as if you were protecting a regrowth, but you just do it and leave it there. Maybe it's just 2 meters, maybe it's 5 meters. It depends on, how big your garden is. And just see what regrows naturally and be curious. And there are even apps that will allow you to detect. And you look if you have any seedlings, anything that's naturally in the soil that will grow up, and kind of stay curious and observe before you add things in.
Yeah, that's a really great tip. I know that's something we've done in our garden, where we've ended up with cherry trees coming up, whereas if we had sort of mown the whole year and just kept on doing it, it would have just destroyed all of that. And it's wonderful to see it now, especially in the spring in the UK, to see everything that starts like to emerge. So, it comes back to that moment of curiosity as a child for me.
That's why it's also important, sorry to interrupt you, not to clear up too much. So you want to leave dead wood. If you have a little bit of brambles, obviously you want to enjoy your garden or your space, but don't remove all those brambles, because under the brambles, other things can grow that maybe, even if you have deer or rabbits, maybe you don't have them, but it still protects them, it still shades them. So brambles are actually a great nursing tree for seedlings. You have some other trees that will grow fast and will create the shade and condition, and they're called nurse trees, such as, birch and hazel, all these trees that grow fast. And you can even do dead edges, which for us is simply when we fell the ash, we use the branches that have been felled, obviously not the heavier timber. And you create kind of lines. And under there, you have so much regrowth because it gets sheltered from browsing. It gets sheltered from sunlight. It gets the sunlight and the rain, but less than it would normally, so it doesn't get parched.
with this idea of like leaving certain things on the ground and so on, normally the sort of resistance that I encounter is concerns about fire-prone areas. How do you manage that?
So every country, every latitude is very different. Actually, here in the UK, our woods are fairly fire resistant. And, I want to be careful with what I say because we've had problems with fire as well. But most of the broadleaves are not particularly flammable. And what happens is year after year, the layer of leaves that falls and gets compacted with the rain, etc., is not very flammable, which is very different. I'm from Italy, from, say, the forest that you have in Italy or in Greece with conifers, which are very fire prone. And in a way, interestingly, if you think over thousands of years, that's almost a competitive advantage for trees. Conifers grow faster than broadleaves. So conifers are almost made to burn. And then the broadleaves will burn as well. And then the conifers will take over because they're faster. Like if you think of it through century and millennial, that's how conifers have competed. Obviously, in a world like we have now, where natural spaces are limited, we don't want that to happen because, again, the extent that we have that is forested is so limited and so hard for one space to communicate with the other that it's harder. But yeah, we're not overly concerned at the moment with that. It is, of course, important if you have open spaces that you manage them well. Again, depending on the region, some regions make cuts through their forests to avoid the propagating of fire. So you really have to look at the macro level and follow any local guidelines that you're given. If your guidelines are to mow the grass in the summer, then you should always obey what the regulations are because every land is so different. But here, thankfully, we are a little bit more sheltered.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's definitely good to give awareness to these things because we are changing. The climate is changing, isn't it? And the way that we see things and everything evolves and changes. Coming back then to the assessment of the land and talking about that in a bit more detail, you mentioned just now around ash, and there was sort of an ash dieback disease, wasn't there, recently in the UK? How do you handle things like that in the forest, and how could we translate that as well to our gardens?
So unfortunately, still undergoing. This winter, we've had to remove about 200 ash down there, but a lot of land is still being treated. The first thing to be aware is, one, be aware of the plants that you have and be aware overall of their health and if there are major things like that. Ash dieback, unfortunately, is a tragedy for all of the UK. It's not the first time it happened. We lost all elm, I think, some decades ago, and now the elm is slowly regrowing. Be aware also if you have trees that are healthy. So about 1% of ashes are healthy. We are lucky to have 3, which, more or less is the percentage. So I've actually signaled those to the Living Ash Project so that there are entities that are looking at the genetic materials and try to identify healthy trees and whether we can get seed bank from them and learn from them and help repopulate. But if you have things like that, unfortunately, again, it is about following guidance. The longer you wait with ash, the more dangerous it becomes to fell. They're pretty big trees and some of them become dry. They become very tricky to fell. You need skilled labor. We have a shortage of skilled labor. That's why it's been done for me this year, not the last. I've been on it since year 1. So, I think the first thing is to be aware. The second is ensure you have biodiversity. Again, that's why we are definitely not recommending monoculture because, again, we will see more parasites. It is very likely, especially with the climate changing. So just having that diversity helped. I had a lot of ash at the bottom, not too much throughout the wood. Probably that ash had taken over from elm because now we have elm seedlings and elm saplings coming up. So I've replanted some of that area as hazel just to protect the edge of the forest because edge trees tend to be the more resistant, but also the more exposed. And I want something that will grow as fast as I can and create kind of an edge. You want your edge trees to be maybe a little bit lower, a little bit sturdier and funnel that wind up if you can. But essentially it is about biodiversity. So now in that area I've also planted wild fruit trees, And I haven't been able to plant any elm because I wasn't able to buy any. There's also a challenge with nursery, with the demand for trees for planting. But I do have elm regeneration. I've built 2 exclosures up, and I'm waiting another year to finish the forwarding. And then I'll probably build a couple of exclosures just to see what's in the seed bank that sprouts up.
Wow, you are certainly a busy lady.
It does keep you busy. I'm happy that I have good help. We've always been able to find good volunteers. And then I've worked a lot with the local community. So the local council has been very responsive. They've been very, very welcoming of me, even as some city woman coming from somewhere else and not knowing much about trees 2 years ago. I've been able to work with my neighbors, the 2 farms around. They've been quite helpful. Even after the storm, they helped me. Luckily, we were not too affected, but they helped me clear up a couple of trees that were dangerous because they were standing on an angle. Like, we really work with the local community and we support each other quite a bit. And I think if you have a garden, that's also something to do as much as you can, because the smaller the land, the more interdependent you are from each other. So when you think of haze, think in terms of how would wildlife move around, how would foxes move around, how would birds move around. And if you can have a level of collaboration, that will always help nature, because they don't think at the scale at which we think.
Yeah, I think it's one of the lovely, amazing things about, I suppose, what we call gardening, or even, looking at permaculture and other things, which I'm no expert at, but obviously trying to move in that direction, is this idea of collaborating and building communities. Like, that's very exciting, isn't it? As human beings, we're used to really working communities, but we've sort of developed this experience of doing things very individually. So it's great to hear your story, that actually collaborating with the council, because that's not always the best relationship, and collaborating with your farmer neighbours, there is a relationship being built there, not only with fellow human beings but fellow nature as well, which whether that sentence makes sense or not, I think I know what I'm trying to say. Thank you, Laura, that's really, really interesting. Ines, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a lot. So so one of the things you just mentioned is about growing some food trees. So how are you is that a part of the business that you're trying to explore within the woodland, or what else do you do there? Are you growing trees also for wood, or what is going on business side?
So I'm still trying to strike the balance. I was actually hoping that the timber sold from the felling, including of the ash, would cover for the cost of felling. Unfortunately, it hasn't done that. So at the moment, we're still out of pocket. But I would like to find a way to break even at least. I don't think we'd have fruit to the extent that you can sell it. At the moment, I'm also looking more at encouraging diversity. So I've put some prickly pear, I put some crab apples. I'm trying to encourage fruit that is natural fruit. We have cherries, but the cherries are so far up, you can't even really see the flowers. Like, those are all for wildlife. So essentially, any fruit that's coming out of here is for wildlife. I have a plan of putting sweet maple. I couldn't find any saplings this year. So that one day could yield into a production of syrup, which I think could at least get to family use. Maybe we'll put a couple of beehives. This year has been too busy and now we missed the window. But for next year, I'm thinking to put a couple of beehives. So in terms of production, we can do very little. There's a couple of things. Hazel and some of the tin coppice is considered literally a wood crop, because you can cut it fairly young every few years and you can sell the sticks. And there's actually a market for those, not only for basket making, but for a number of things, including, like the canes for the support. So that's probably going to be a crop that can give something every few years. Timber, I want now to wait a little bit. The larch that was here had been marked for felling, but because we had to remove so much of the ash, I didn't want to take too much of the biomass out of the wood. But probably in 3-4 years, we could harvest some of the larch, I still will want to keep some as future entrant trees because they're doing really well. They're just gorgeous trees. But I think we'll have the ability to do some felling for timber for the ash for the larch in a few years once the forest has kind of reassessed itself. And that will again be also good for regeneration because once you have light, you have regrowth. So you try to balance the different species. And then what I'm trying to do is leave no trace activities, things like forest baiting, meditation in the wood. We do a very limited amount of wild camping. Even as an owner, I'm not allowed to spend more than 26 nights a year on site, simply to prevent people trying to build illegal campsite. And then little by little, it's all covered. But we do a limited amount of that. So we've done those sorts of activities, primarily leave no trace bases, but try to bring a little bit of funding to the wood. And then with some of the larch that was felled, it's such a small quantity, I couldn't sell it. So what we're planning is to plank it and build bird boxes and bat boxes and have a couple of workshops where people come over, they pay to build their own. My forester teach them to do it. And, all of those things will go against essentially offsetting the cost of the wood. But I don't think with 9 acres, it's credible to have it's revenue generating. You can do a little. Last summer, we even filmed that Google advertising here. So that brought a few £100. Essentially just pays for the woodlands upkeep.
Yeah, that's fabulous. I like this idea of productizing or like creating services that doesn't necessarily mean things. This is a bit of a side question. So one thing I really struggle and I see very often is brittle plastic things around, right? And I twinge every time. So talking about trees, what about tree guards? Are they really necessary when planting? Or is there more natural forms of such an early days sort of deterrence, so avoiding, I don't know if protection is the right word, but yeah, what's your take?
Look, like everything, it depends. There start to be more nature-friendly material, but the reality is they're significantly more expensive than plastic tree guards. And when you start to plant 500, 2,000, depending on what you're doing, it can be significant. I always believe in circular economy and reusing. So the tree guards that we've used here have all been recycled from other places. So that's one way to do it. I'm hoping that, in 3-4 years, we can get rid of these ones, and we probably won't get rid of them. We'll actually either reuse them ourselves or donate them like they've been donated to me. So I think there's a circularity you can have. One thing that concerns me, you have different types of tree guards. So these tree guards are actually soft. They open and roll around, which means if the plant grows, they will not suffocate it. Unfortunately, as you've seen in the news just last week, in many cases, plants have been planted with tree guards that are not flexible. They're a little bit bigger than these ones, but they're not. And if the tree is maturing into it and growing, and nobody goes there to remove them, the tree can actually die just from the guard. So it's just coincidental that I haven't used those. But I think if you use them, you have to make sure that there is a commitment to come and remove them and keep an eye. I don't think what some of the newspapers have advocates in terms of watering trees in nature is possible. I don't have any near water source. I don't have any electricity to do it. But I think you have to make sure that whatever you put in the environment, you know when it's going to come off. We also haven't put it for all the plants. So as you see, some of our trees have guards. These are trees that are particularly interesting to deer. This is a yew tree that we planted last month. It's doing all right. This hasn't been guarded. I would say of the 500 trees that we put guards around the hazel because it's really near the hare dens and because it's a tree that gets demanded. We've put guards against a few of the thorn trees and some of the others. Prickly pears are pretty sturdy. They take care of themselves. So whenever we found trees that have limited browsing, there's a strength in numbers. I wouldn't put them. When you know that you're planting something, we do have deer. Here, we've seen them actually the days we came planting. They sometimes spend the night at the wood in the winter. Now they're away. So yeah, you do want to protect them. And literally, if we have time to go down to the hazel, I'll show you some of them have been browsed right at the limit of the guard. So I want to be pragmatic that sometimes plastic is useful, but you have to put it responsible. Here, another example of a tree that we planted that didn't have a guard. So it's a judgment call.
Thanks for that. And I think we're sort of like coming to time, but as a practitioner, we cover a lot of different things, but on this field, what else do you pay attention to, like sort of key takeaways for anybody? Like it's just, we spoke about so many things: biodiversity, learn what it works, careful with the soil, increase the variety, guards, like so much of it. What else?
I think the most important thing is, again, not missing the big picture and missing the forest. So first, remember to enjoy. Every time I come here, there is so much to do. But I also want to make sure to spend some time just in the hammock, get immersed, listen to the forest, be curious. It changes all the time. I'm having another friend coming from the village with a bat detector soon. Like, try and stay curious, listen what's going around, enjoy. But also remember the big picture. So, for example, one of the first things I did when I got the woodland was to register a permissive footpath to allow walking not on the street, because there's a lot of walker in this area. The road is narrow, cars go fast, but I also wanted to funnel traffic. So both I wanted pedestrians to be safe, and I also didn't want them to go all over the place because there is no path and they'll try and cut. So try and understand. One of the first things I did was to install a gate. Again, we found some recycled metal and then, a welder, and we installed the gate, but against fly tipping. Unfortunately, we've had 3 episodes of fly tipping on the parking lot across the street, but none in the wood. So you want to be aware of the community, what you can do good for the community. There's walkers, I keep them informed every time through the local community groups and so on what's going on. But you also want to make sure that you are aware of what risk is in the wood. So making sure that there's no bikers, in this case for erosion, making sure that you work with people on what is good and not good, that you assess a little bit the wildlife that transit in and not just resident. What does that mean? And so on. We've evaluated having a pond. We decided against it for a number of reasons. So try to remember to keep the big picture in mind, as well as caring for the small details and caring for the individual plants.
Thank you, Lara. And with that, we sort of had time. So where shall we send the audience to learn more about the work that you do?
So anyone can connect with us, www.walkwoodhp5.co.uk. And if you're interested in this idea of using natural spaces on a leave no trace basis, we also have notraces.co.uk. which is an initiative with a couple of co-founders where we're helping to connect small wood owners and small landowners like me with people who need a natural space, whether it's for filming or for an offsite or for corporate volunteering and so on.
Yeah, No Traces is a whole new episode perhaps in the future. So thank you ever so much again to be with us. Stay tuned. Another video of these adventures of Sustainable You in 2 weeks. And we see you soon.